In 1903, William Harley and Arthur Davidson built their first motorcycle inside a wooden shed behind the Davidson family home on Milwaukee's west side. The shed measured 10 feet wide and 15 feet long. They hand-lettered the words Harley-Davidson Motor Company above the door. Today, that west side neighborhood, like so much of the Rust Belt, tells a different story, one that involves urban decay and a question about what happens to a city when the thing that made it is slowly, quietly, officially relocated elsewhere. That detail is worth holding for a moment, not because it's charming, but because it locates the company precisely, not in a factory, not in a boardroom, not in a city chosen for its tax incentives or its proximity to a shipping port. In a backyard on a residential street in a mid-sized Midwestern city, because that's where William Harley and Arthur Davidson lived, and that's where they built things. From that address, everything else followed. By 1906, they had outgrown the shed and built their first real factory on Juneau Avenue, 3 blocks away. By 1910, the campus had grown into a complex of massive, pale yellow brick buildings that would define that stretch of the west side for the next 100 years. By 1918, Harley-Davidson was the largest motorcycle manufacturer in the world. More than a third of its production was being exported. The American military was placing orders the company struggled to fill fast enough. Milwaukee didn't just house Harley-Davidson. In the way that certain companies and certain cities come to mean each other, the way Akron once meant rubber, the way Hershey, Pennsylvania still has a street called Chocolate Avenue, Milwaukee was Harley-Davidson. The machinists and tool makers who built the engines lived in the neighborhood surrounding the Juneau Avenue campus. Their children grew up with factory work as an assumed future, not a fallback. Social clubs formed around the brand, racing leagues built tracks nearby, and by 1940, more than a dozen Harley-Davidson clubs operated in Milwaukee alone. When soldiers came home from the Second World War, the company had manufactured roughly 90,000 military motorcycles during the conflict. Many of them came home to jobs on the assembly lines. That post-war generation became the core of the workforce for the next 2 decades. For a long time, the company and the city reinforced each other in ways that were hard to separate. The factory employed Milwaukee. Milwaukee gave the factory its identity. That relationship felt permanent because it had been consistent for so long. It wasn't permanent. And Harley-Davidson was not the only company making that kind of promise to Milwaukee and then breaking it. A.O. Smith Corporation, which had manufactured automobile frames and then pressure vessels from a massive complex on the north side of the city, wound down its Milwaukee operations across the 1980s and 1990s. Alice Chalmers, once one of the largest manufacturers of agricultural and industrial equipment in the world, employing tens of thousands in Milwaukee's Menomonee Valley, went bankrupt in 1985. Pabst Brewing Company closed its Milwaukee brewery in 1996, ending more than a century and a half of production in the city that had been the beer capital of the country. By the time Harley-Davidson was navigating its own 21st century transition, Milwaukee had already lost over 100,000 manufacturing jobs since the post-war peak. The city had watched industry after industry make the same calculation and reach the same conclusion. This pattern, this Rust Belt exodus of capital and employment from the places that built American industry, did not begin with Harley-Davidson, and it would not end there. In 1969, American Machine and Foundry Company, a New York conglomerate with interests in sporting goods, bowling equipment, and leisure products, purchased Harley-Davidson. The founders' families, who had managed the company continuously since 1903, agreed to the merger to avoid a hostile takeover by a buyer they considered worse. AMF pushed for higher production volumes. Quality suffered. The bikes that came off the Milwaukee lines in the early 1970s had a reputation for unreliability they hadn't carried before. Japanese manufacturers were building lighter, cleaner motorcycles that didn't leak oil and selling them to Americans at prices Harley couldn't match. The company was in serious trouble. Then in 1973, AMF moved final motorcycle assembly out of Milwaukee. The receiving plant was in York, Pennsylvania. Milwaukee retained component manufacturing, engines, parts, subassemblies. But the work of actually completing a Harley-Davidson motorcycle, the final assembly that turned components into the product the company had built its reputation on, moved 500 miles east. No announcement described this as a turning point in the relationship between the company and the city. It was framed as an operational decision made by ownership. And then it was done, and people adjusted. The management buyout came in 1981. 13 executives led by Vaughn Beals purchased the company back from AMF for $80 million. They lobbied Congress for tariff protection on imported heavyweight motorcycles. They redesigned the engines, tightened quality controls, rebuilt the dealer relationships. It took most of the decade. The recovery required the company's loyal customers to keep buying motorcycles that were still improving while competitors were already selling bikes that worked better, and enough of them did. By the early 1990s, Harley-Davidson had turned itself around. The company that had been written off a decade earlier was now profitable, growing, and this part mattered, symbolic. The brand came to represent something beyond motorcycles. It represented American manufacturing resilience, a workforce that had been through the worst of it and come out the other side. The Menomonee Falls plant, 10 miles northwest of Milwaukee, became the main engine production facility for everything built in the United States. Around 600 union workers made the engines there. The company opened its museum on the Milwaukee waterfront in 2008, 130,000 square feet of company history on a 20-acre campus right in the valley where the founders had started, with a shed and a hand-lettered sign. At some point during this period, Harley-Davidson made a promise. The precise phrasing changed depending on who was speaking and when, but the substance stayed consistent. Harley-Davidson motorcycles sold in the American market would always be built in America. It was stated in press releases, in interviews, and eventually in public commitments made by company executives. For the workers in Menomonee Falls and for the customers who'd kept faith with the brand through the bad years, it was not a small promise. The Thailand plant opened in 2018. Harley explained it in clear terms. Thailand imposed tariffs of up to 60% on imported motorcycles. A manufacturing facility there meant avoiding those tariffs and gaining access to preferential trade deals with the rest of Southeast Asia. The trade policy architecture that made this kind of move possible, the same framework that had been accelerating industrial relocation out of the Rust Belt since the 1990s, had simply caught up with Harley-Davidson. The motorcycles built in Thailand were for the Asian market. American jobs were not part of this calculation. In the first quarter of 2019, Harley-Davidson announced it would close its motorcycle assembly plant in Kansas City, Missouri. 572 workers lost their jobs. The remaining domestic assembly operations would consolidate at the York, Pennsylvania facility. The company stated clearly that the Kansas City closure and the Thailand expansion were separate, unrelated decisions. A machine repairman who had spent years at the Kansas City plant offered his own interpretation to reporters. They are sending our jobs overseas. Absolutely. A union president at the facility said he had asked company executives multiple times what it would take to keep the plant open. He never got an answer that came with terms he could work with. The 572 workers in Kansas City drew their own conclusions. The plant closed and that chapter ended. Back in Milwaukee, the Juneau Avenue headquarters had been sitting largely empty since the pandemic closed it in 2020. In October of 2022, CEO Jochen Zeitz told Bloomberg that the company planned to repurpose the 500,000 square foot complex. Zeitz was at that time working primarily from his home in Santa Fe, New Mexico, part of the broader executive migration toward the Sun Belt and remote work arrangements that had been reshaping corporate geography for years. When he was in Wisconsin, his office was at the Research and Development Complex in Wauwatosa, not on Juneau Avenue. The building that had housed Harley-Davidson since 1906, constructed in stages, expanded in 1912, 1913, and 1966, sitting on the same block as the backyard where the company was founded, was going to be reconsidered. Zeitz described the shift toward remote work as something that democratizes the way we work together and allows you to bring the best talent into the company no matter where they sit. Over the next 2 years, the company turned a large portion of the unused parking lots adjacent to the campus into a $20 million public park designed by a London architecture firm. A section of the building was sold to a craft distillery. Event space was developed in another part of the complex. The Milwaukee Business Journal noted that the neighborhood surrounding the campus, Milwaukee's near west side, already facing economic and social pressures, stood to feel the de-emphasis of what had long been a major local employer and landmark. That near west side neighborhood has been facing those pressures for a long time. The vacancy rates in the commercial corridors closest to the Juneau Avenue campus have climbed steadily over the past 2 decades. Milwaukee has lost roughly 100,000 residents since its 1960 population peak. The blocks that once housed the blue-collar workforce that built the engines, the machinists, the tool makers, the assembly workers and their families have seen the kind of population loss and disinvestment that is visible in the built environment, storefronts that don't reopen, housing stock that deteriorates faster than it's maintained, the physical texture of urban decay settling into streets that were once organized around the assumption of stable industrial employment. The Tower Automotive site on Milwaukee's north side, an abandoned stamping plant that sat vacant for years before redevelopment efforts began, is one of the more visible symbols of what deindustrialization leaves behind in a city like Milwaukee. The Allis-Chalmers complex in West Allis, once one of the largest industrial campuses in Wisconsin, took decades to partially repurpose. These sites don't disappear, they sit. They become arguments about what a city owes its industrial past and what it can realistically afford to do with it. None of this constitutes legal abandonment, but it is a particular kind of transformation, a company converting that active operational presence into civic gesture, replacing manufacturing identity with the curated appearance of community investment. In August of 2024, Harley-Davidson announced that production of its Pan America Sportster, Nightster, and Sport Series models would move from the Menomonee Falls facility to Thailand. The International Association of Machinists and Aerospace Workers said its members had been stabbed in the back. The union pointed to the CEO's prior commitment that Harley-Davidson motorcycles sold in the United States market would always be built in the United States. This was, by the union's account, the first time in the company's history that motorcycles destined for American customers would be assembled overseas. Harley-Davidson called it a temporary transition, a model year 2025 measure, and stated that American employment at its facilities would not be affected by the move. Workers leaving the Menomonee Falls plant that August would not give their names to the television cameras waiting outside. They did not want their faces shown. Asked how people inside the plant were feeling, one worker paused and said he felt pretty nervous. Another answered the question differently, asked what workers were thinking inside the plant. He said it was coming. He said they could see the writing on the wall. These were the workers at the main engine production facility, the facility that had been the core of what Milwaukee contributed to a Harley-Davidson motorcycle. 600 union members making the engines. The company said their jobs were not at risk. The workers who would not give their names on camera were not sure how to hold that assurance alongside the fact of what had just been announced. The financial results for 2025 were not easy to read charitably. Harley-Davidson recorded an operating loss of $29 million for the year. Global motorcycle sales fell 12% from 2024. In North America, the market the company had always described as its foundation, the market the Built in America promise was made to, sales dropped 13%. Profits fell 26%, landing at $339 million. Tariffs had cost the company $67 million in 2025, and the company projected they would cost between $75 and $105 million in 2026. A dozen Harley-Davidson dealerships closed in 2025. More followed in the first months of 2026. Artie Starrs, who became president and CEO in October of 2025, addressed analysts in February of 2026. He said the company's manufacturing capacity and overall operating expenses were built for materially higher volumes than today's demand, and that Harley intended to address the mismatch between what the factories could produce and what customers were buying. The details of how that mismatch would be addressed were not part of the February statement. More would follow. In March of 2026, Harley-Davidson confirmed a reduction in force affecting its global workforce. The company declined to specify how many employees were affected or where they worked. Brad Dorff of the United Steelworkers said none of the 500 plus union members at the Milwaukee or Menomonee Falls facilities were included in those cuts, at least not in that round. He said he was watching what the coming months brought. I'm always concerned about reductions in jobs and job loss, he said. Harley-Davidson remains headquartered at 3700 West Juneau Avenue, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. The new CEO works from the campus. The museum is still open on the waterfront. The park, built on the old parking lots, has native plantings and a sunken stage and more than 100 species of trees and perennials selected in consultation with the Forest County Potawatomi, whose land this once was. The Menomonee Falls plant is still running. The 600 workers are still there making the engines. Some of those engines go into motorcycles assembled in York, Pennsylvania. Some of the models that previously ran through their hands are now assembled in Thailand and shipped back to American dealerships, the ones that are still open. What the mismatch between manufacturing capacity and current demand eventually requires of Milwaukee, of Menomonee Falls, of the 600 workers who have been there since the recovery years, has not been announced yet. Artie Stars said more details were coming. That was February, and it's been a few months. The shed on the west side is long gone. The hand-lettered sign is long gone. The city that organized itself around what was built there is still there, still waiting to find out what comes next, the way Rust Belt cities have been waiting to find out what comes next for the better part of a century.